The concept of divine foreordination and election has been a subject of theological debate for centuries. Many have argued that God predetermined the exact individuals who would be saved, while others contend that God's election pertains to a class of people rather than specific individuals. A close examination of Romans 8:29-30, 9:10-16, 22-23, and 11:7-10 reveals a biblical perspective that does not align with the idea of unconditional individual election. Early gospel preachers seeking to restore New Testament Christianity rejected human creeds and upheld the Bible as the only rule of faith and practice. Through diligent study, they rejected both Calvinistic and Arminian views of predestination, affirming instead that God's foreknowledge does not negate human free will. One perspective that emerged from such studies is that divine foreknowledge does not require God to predetermine every detail of human history. Instead, God has the power to foreknow events without necessarily dictating their outcomes. This distinction allows for both divine sovereignty and human free will to coexist harmoniously. The doctrine of election, as presented in Romans 8 and 9, is best understood as God choosing a category of people, the obedient, rather than selecting specific individuals for salvation. Romans 8:29-30 outlines this principle. Foreknowledge: God approved in advance the type of character that would be saved, those who conform to the image of Christ. Predestination: this refers to the predetermined blessings available to those who obey the gospel, rather than an irreversible selection of individuals, calling those who respond to the gospel invitation. Justification: those who obey and are forgiven of sins. Glorification: the ultimate destiny of the faithful in heaven. Similarly, in Romans 9:10-16, Paul discusses God's sovereign choices, but the context suggests a focus on God's overarching plan rather than an arbitrary selection of individuals. God's dealings with Israel, as well as his extension of mercy to the Gentiles, demonstrate his justice and impartiality rather than a rigid determinism. The class concept of election. Romans chapter 11 verses 7-10 further illustrates that election pertains to a group rather than specific individuals. The obedient, those who accept God's grace through faith, are the ones included in God's chosen people. This aligns with the broader biblical theme that salvation is conditional upon obedience, as stated in Hebrews chapter 5 verse 9. Predestination in Scripture is always connected to God's plan for redemption, not to an arbitrary selection of individuals. God's election is of a group, those who will respond in faith to the gospel, and not an irreversible decree about who will be saved and who will be lost. Conclusion. The Bible does not support the idea of unconditional individual election. Instead, Scripture presents a framework where God, in his foreknowledge, determined the type of people who would receive salvation, those who choose to obey him. This understanding reconciles God's sovereignty with human free will, affirming that while God has a divine plan, individuals are responsible for their response to his calling. Salvation remains open to all who willingly conform to the image of Christ through obedience to the gospel.